It's been a ride. I'm Jennifer Jackson. I'm an internal medicine physician here in Wichita. I have a lot of hats. I do work for the University of Kansas School of Medicine. I'm the associate program director, so I work with the medical students and the residents. I work in the hospital, and I work in the clinic as well. I'm also associated with Via Christi St. Francis. I run some of their what are called transitional care programs, which are programs that are directed at a high-risk patient population, patients with a lot of chronic comorbid medical conditions that are at high risk for not doing well long-term. And then more recently, I have started certifying in functional medicine through the Institute for Functional Medicine at Cleveland Clinic. I will be certified, if I stay on course, I'll be certified in a year, and that's been a really eye-opening journey. I like to start off by telling you about my biases. I don't have any pharmaceutical representation, but I definitely have biases, and that comes from my life experience. First of all, I'm a Christian, and I think that is a filter through which I look at research and science. I've also been married for quite a while. My husband is the goofball on the left there. We've been together for 29 years. We actually got together in high school and stayed together, which I think isn't very common anymore, but he stuck with me. And then I have 3 children who are all very different and all have brought me new information and challenges as I've mothered them. My oldest son is at K-State as a junior. My daughter's a senior in high school. She goes to Rose Hill, and she actually hopes to go to K-State as well. And then I have my youngest, I call him my straggler. He's 12, and he also tells me he's going to go to K-State. So if I successfully get all 3 kids at K-State, I will have done my job, and I can retire. So pretty excited about that. I did also attend K-State. I majored in biology. I love biology. I love the science of biology. I love life. I think it's fascinating. I've been on this food road for a long, long time, and all of these roads have kind of converged together. A few years ago, we started a farm. We have no farming experience at all, but I read a lot of Michael Pollan books and Joel Salatin books and got really excited about sustainable agriculture, and so we just decided to start a farm. And so that's been quite an adventure as well and has led to a lot of this research. And then in my spare time, I like to climb mountains. Anyone else a mountain climber? So, yeah, Colorado 14ers. I do some Taekwondo, and I've recently started trail running, which is, I hate running. I don't know why I'm trail running, but, and then my dad's trying to get me to do the Dirty Kanza this summer. So that's a 200-mile bike race over in the Emporia area. So we'll see if that works out. So this is kind of what I find when I talk about GMOs, is that people don't really know what GMOs are, or they think they know, but it's a confusing topic. I was listening to a Joe Rogan program a few months ago, and I was so frustrated with the person, the expert on the line that was talking, because he was really making the picture what I thought was very confusing. So I'm going to start off with showing a video, if I can remember what they told me about tabbing over to this. Oh, there he is.
According to a new study that was done by Consumer Reports, a majority of packaged goods that are labeled natural are actually contain genetically modified ingredients, which makes it unclear, as to whether they are natural or not, because they grow, but they've been modified in a laboratory or whatever. Apparently, the FDA will allow companies to put the word natural on a product label as long as it says JKLOL on the back of the product. But critics of genetically modified organisms, GMOs, claim that they pose health risks. It's a complicated issue, though, because there isn't a lot of evidence to back that up. Still, some people are dead set against them. There's been legislation designed to limit GMOs. You see documentaries and angry Facebook posts about it. How many of you do not want GMOs in your body? Yes? Okay, a lot of people. All right. So, as I usually do when people take a stance on a complicated issue, I wondered how many people who are against GMOs really know what they are. So we sent a crew to one of our local farmers markets to ask people why they avoid GMOs, and more specifically, what the letters GMO stand for. Enjoy.
Do you try to avoid GMOs in your diet?
I do. Yeah.
Tell me why.
There's just a vibration with GMOs. For me personally, just something that I don't particularly want to put into my body.
What does GMO stand for?
Genetically modified. Genetically modified.
Yo.
The.
Oh.
I don't know.
Bishop Don Magic Wand, what is a GMO?
Well, I'm not really sure. You have to make me familiar with that. What is a GMO?
Do you try to avoid GMOs in your diet?
Yeah, absolutely.
Why is that?
Just the effects, I guess, on myself.
What does GMO stand for?
Oh, man, putting me on under the grill. Let's see. I don't even remember.
Do you try to avoid GMOs in your diet?
Absolutely.
Why?
Because they're not good for you.
What is a GMO?
It's genetically I don't know, what is it?
The rights to seeds. And so when they purchase these seeds and they manipulate the seed itself, they've created a patent on life. Okay, so they own that product. And that is a very important concept as we think about how these approval processes go and who owns the food that they produce. Monsanto, we will talk about quite a bit. There are actually six big, kind of the biggest ag companies, but Monsanto is the one that we will focus on, mainly because they're the biggest in terms of genetically modified seeds. On this slide, if you'll look at the left, those are kind of the big six ag companies. And what's getting ready to happen is they're getting ready to merge with themselves. So, for example, Bayer is getting ready to purchase Monsanto. That's been in the works now for about a year. And DuPont and Dow are also looking at a potential merger, which they're already huge corporations, and this just makes them, mega huge? Here is a graph that kind of shows you a breakdown of the big ag seed companies and who owns the seeds. And from this graph, you can see that Monsanto controls the seed market bigger than any of the other single companies. And so just going back in history, Monsanto is actually a company that was started in Missouri. They were the makers of DDT. Does anyone remember DDT? Yeah. They created bovine growth hormone, which was used in cows to increase their milk production. Agent Orange, anyone remember Agent Orange? Yeah, exactly. And then aspartame, which is a artificial sweetener, and then, of course, more recently, genetically modified organisms. So they've been in the market now for quite a few years. One of the concerns about this company specifically is how much the industry has influenced the level of the federal government. This is certainly not an all-inclusive list, but if you look on your right, that's the role that the person had at Monsanto. The middle is the person. The left is what the role they had in the federal government. And some of the scarier ones I've tried to circle here, the deputy administrator of the EPA, the USDA, EPA, the commissioner of the FDA, and then you have, of course, Clarence Thomas, who's a Supreme Court justice. One of the issues has been that Monsanto will put forward information or legislation, and the person who wrote the legislation at Monsanto will then turn around and approve their own legislation at the level of the federal government. So there's been a lot of kind of this revolving door between industry and government that has been kind of is on a repeated theme, especially with that particular company. So I'd like to get to the definition of genetically modified by first reviewing what's called classical plant breeding. So classical plant breeding is what most of us are familiar with. It uses, you identify traits in a plant that are desirable, and you use pollination through a process to hybridize the plants. And so tomatoes, that's how many people grow tomatoes in their garden? Great. Yeah, a lot of the tomato, unless you're growing heirloom varieties of tomatoes, a lot of these are hybridized varieties, right? We have the big boy and then we have the better boy, and they're chosen for all sorts of things: early ripening, bigger disease resistance, pest resistance, flavor, color, and they've been grown over time, over generations. So that's hybridization, that's classical plant breeding. Genetic modification is different in that we actually go after the gene that produces whatever trait that you're going after. So if you have a gene that extends the shelf life of an apple, they can isolate that specific gene and then they can implant it into the DNA of the plant. They use this in two methods. One is called a genome particle gun, where they actually shoot the genetic material into the nucleus of the cell. Or they use what's called plasmid transfer, which is an ability to use a vector to kind of invade the cell and insert the DNA into the plant. And then they grow the plant up, and that's called genetic modification. So hybrid versus GNO, a hybrid, it uses pollination, it takes generations, and it's not a very exact science, right? You may get the trait you want, you may not get the trait you want. The plant might grow, it might not grow, etc. Genetic modification is very selective for the trait that you're wanting to perpetuate. But it does have the potential to create a brand new species, and we're going to visit that on the next slide. So I think one of the things that really muddies the water is this idea of cisgenic versus transgenic genetic modification, okay? And so I want to go into this just a little bit. Cisgenic is you take a gene from one tomato plant and you put it into another tomato plant, okay? And that's a cisgenic. If you use a particle gun or plasmid transfer, that's GMO. But transgenic is taking a piece of DNA from one organism and putting it into a completely different organism. In addition, those organisms would never have come together in nature. And so the example, and I'll go through these here in a minute, but the example is you're going to take a gene from a bacteria and you're going to insert it into a corn plant. And the corn is now going to secrete a toxin. And so that's a transgenic modification. And then newest on the market is genome editing. This is called CRISPR. It's very interesting technology, very smooth. The advantages of CRISPR over GMO are that it's even more specific and it's less expensive to produce. In layman's terms, basically what they've done is they've identified the starting block for a gene, and they're able to go in, clip it, remove it, take new genes, put them in. Okay? So there's lots of applications of this. It's very controversial because basically what we're talking about is potentially editing the genome of humans. Human trials have already started, mainly in Japan. They've looked at getting rid of thalassemia by removing the thalassemia gene. Most recently, this was in September, this is a morning glory plant, and the plant on the right is the native species, and they were able to remove the color gene and turn it white with the CRISPR technology. So this hasn't been applied really outside of the labs yet, but there's lots and lots of increasing number of trials that are going on and many applications that people are pretty excited about. So this is a not all-inclusive list of genetically modified crops. Not all of these are available at markets, and some have come and left the market. I just like to throw this slide up in case you're interested. You can go to this website and find out what the genetically modified organisms are, what the actual modification is, and if they've been approved, and if they're actually at market. This is the Center for Environmental Risk Assessment. It's a really nice database. If you're looking for, like, say, corn, or you're looking for a certain company, or you're just interested to see what's out there, this is a pretty all-inclusive database. The newest GMO on the market is the Arctic apple. It has been approved and is now being shipped to stores. The Arctic apple is a SISgenic modification. That means it's apple to apple. What they've done is they've made it so that the apples do not brown when they're cut. And so they think that this will obviously extend shelf life, and that consumers will think that this is a pretty good deal by not having a lot of it will reduce food waste is their hope. All right, so we're going to go through the different types of genetic modification that are common right now. Insect resistance and herbicide resistance, those are the ones that are the most controversial. And then we have viral resistance and nutrient composition. So the BtToxin is one of the most common genetic modifications that's out in the market. BtToxin is naturally secreted by a bacteria that lives in the soil. And so what the scientists have done is they've isolated that gene, and they've taken the gene that produces the toxin and they've inserted it into corn and soybeans and cotton. And so what happens is when a pest lands on the plant and they start to eat the plant, the toxin is, they ingest the DNA that secretes the toxin, and it causes them to die. And so the thought was that by doing this, by planting these plants that they are can kill the bugs, that it would decrease pesticide use and exposure. The second most common in the market is called an herbicide resistance, or Roundup Ready. So glyphosate is the most commonly used herbicide in the world. It's been thought for a long time to be very safe and very effective. What they've done is they've engineered plants to be resistant to the herbicide. And so in essence, a farmer can plant a huge field of corn or soybeans or cotton, and then they can spray their crop with the weed killer. It doesn't kill the plant, but it kills all of the weeds. And so this has been employed in many different types of foods that are available now. Viral resistance, papaya, the Hawaii papaya industry was almost extinct because of the ring spot virus, and they were able to genetically modify the papaya to resist that virus, and so that's the most common example of the viral resistance. And then what we're seeing increasingly flood the market now is which are SISgenic modifications to plants. The Flavor Saver tomato was the first GMO to be available. However, it had like an enhanced shelf life. It's been taken off the market since then. You may have heard of golden rice. It has an increased amount of vitamin A in it, and it was thought that it was going to reverse several nutritional deficiencies in developing countries. That hasn't come to pass at this time. They're looking at wheat. It's not available yet, but they're looking at a gluten-free wheat that's been genetically modified. They're looking at changing the composition of canola oil to try to make it a healthier option. We've already talked about the Arctic apple with the non-browning, which is now at market. The potatoes are at market. They have been made so that they don't bruise very easily, and those have been available now for a little while. And I think the next that's coming out is the pink pineapple. It's been genetically engineered to have more lycopene, so it's supposed to be a healthier pineapple. I think that's supposed to come out in the next year. In terms of where the GMOs are at, it's mainly corn, cotton, and soy. Almost 100% of soy in the United States is genetically modified. The HT means herbicide tolerance. Oops, sorry. Here we go, herbicide tolerant, and the BT is the botulism toxin. And most of the corn that's grown is both herbicide and has botulism toxin as well. And so if you think about soy, cotton, corn, where are those at in your pantry? This is where you're going to find them. So if you think about corn, we overproduce corn in this country, and we take it to the lab and we make it into all these other things like maltodextrin and things like that. And we put them in a lot of different foods as thickeners, as flavor enhancers, et cetera. So anything that's corn made or corn derived is potentially genetically modified. Of course, corn syrup is obvious. If the label says sugar, it's probably a GMO sugar beet. About 95% of sugar beets in this country are genetically modified. If it says cane sugar, that's not the case. But if it just says sugar, it's probably sugar from a sugar beet, and that's most likely going to be genetically modified. Anything that says vegetable oil, most of the seeds, the cotton, canola, soybean seeds that they make the vegetable oil from have been genetically modified, and so you're going to see that a lot in your salad dressings and that sort of thing. The soy lectins, obviously it's derived from soy, with 95% of soy being GMO. You're going to see soy lectin is like in everything. If you ever read the labels, it's always one of the bottom ingredients. I think it's even in chocolate chips. It's very depressing. And one of the 4 food groups, right? And then, of course, most of these crops are actually not grown for food. They're called commodity crops, and they're grown to feed to livestock in concentrated animal feeding operations. And so when you think about your soy, your corn, your alfalfa, all of that is shipped off to feeding yards, and so it enters into your animals. And there's been some animal studies on the effects of that as well. I think the most recent thing that's come out is about the farm salmon and about how feeding them an artificial diet, mostly GMO, changes the nutrient composition of the fish that you eat, which is why we talk about eating wild. All right, so what I've learned about this topic is if you start having any questions, one of the tactics is to say that you're against technology. And so that actually has a name. It's called biotechnophobia. A few years ago, I wrote one of our congressmen about this topic, and I basically got a letter back that said, all scientists agree that these are safe, and you just need to be quiet and send me a donation. So that person didn't get my vote. So anyways, but there's a lot of questions that's surrounding this technology. It's really neat technology, but there are a lot of questions. And unfortunately, these questions have not been allowed to be asked. And I think now people are asking the questions. I think one of the questions now is it too late? And I think what I'll probably tell you is, yeah, it's probably too late. So this is the GMO testing and approval process. Basically, the FDA says, hey, you should do some safety studies, and you guys give us your data, and we'll trust you. And that's pretty much how these things come to market. They do 90-day safety trials, usually on rats, to show that they're safe, and then they're put out. So this is what it looks like. This is a picture of it. And so what happens? Well, when people don't trust the industry, then people get kind of nervous, right? And then they start looking for more government regulation, and the government and the industries are kind of in this together, and so there's a lot of turmoil, a lot of finger pointing. So we're going to go through the serious safety events that have been demonstrated over the past 20 years of these products being available. On the left is the agenda. On the right is a quote that I found yesterday. When I was reading about the Arctic apple, this reporter said there's no evidence that GMO foods cause any health problems whatsoever. And I would definitely argue with that statement, and I hope you'll agree with me when I'm done. So the first idea is that anytime you create a new substance like this, you're potentially creating a new allergen. I mean, these are brand new proteins, and people can react to them, and we just don't know. So every single modification has to be tested for toxins and allergies. So that did happen. StarLink Corn, this happened about 15 years ago. They were using the botulism toxin corn idea that we talked about. They were using a protein that was very similar to that, but had not been used before. And so there was some concern that this might cause allergies. The other thing about this protein that was interesting was it kind of hung around in the gut for longer than a normal protein does. And so if it did cause damage, then there was a longer exposure time with this particular one. And so the FDA licensed it for animal feed only. It was not to be used for human consumption, only animals. But that did not happen. And the StarLink corn did get into the food system. And there was a great fallout from that. It depressed the corn market by almost 10% for over a year. There were several lawsuits. The people from Taco Bell who were exposed brought a lawsuit which was dismissed. There were about 58 cases of people that came forward claiming injury, and a few of those cases did go on to successfully sue and received money for damages. The farmers had to be compensated because they lost money in crops. The suppliers also had to be compensated. Several countries declined to have corn aid sent to their country. So these are places that may be starving, but they didn't want this corn shipped to their country. They didn't want this species in their country. And interestingly, I found that this corn is still in the food supply as of 2013. They found it as far as Saudi Arabia. And so when they went back and investigated how did it get into the human food supply, they kind of traced it back to a grain mill. The grain mill was receiving corn from 6 different suppliers, and they didn't keep separate what was for animals and what was for humans. But you can see the far-reaching effects that this had, and it did cause harm. A second example of allergens happened with Pioneer Hybrid. So they had soybeans. These soybeans were heading to be used for chicken feed, but you have to supplement the amino acid methionine. And what Pioneer Hybrid had done is they had actually isolated a protein from the Brazil nuts that would provide the methionine to the soybeans, and so you wouldn't have to supplement the chicken feed. But they thought, some people have a nut allergy. This might be a problem. And that was the company said that. But the FDA said, don't worry about it. It'll be fine. But the company was like, StarLink had just happened, so maybe they were kind of paying attention. The FDA recommended labeling the product, and we would just use it for chicken feed, but actually Pioneer Hybrid pulled it out. What they did is they tested, and there was a lab somewhere that had blood, and they used that blood to test the soybean, and there was a cross-reactivity. People would have reacted, just like they did to a nut allergy. And so Pioneer was like, no, we're pulling our product. This is too dangerous, and that was probably the right thing to do. A second issue besides allergen is toxins. This was an interesting case. So tryptophan is a supplement that's used pretty commonly for like sleep disorders, and it's been a safe over-the-counter supplement for years. A company in Japan, Showa Denko, used genetically modified tryptophan in their supplements. And what they did is they'd been producing tryptophan for years. What they did is they figured out a way to get the bacteria to produce it. And they used that tryptophan because they wanted to increase their production, but they didn't have to tell anyone because the methods were already considered safe, and tryptophan is considered safe. And so they just started marketing it. Well, there were 1,500 cases and over 40 deaths from something that's a pretty uncommon disease, which is basically an inflammatory condition of the lungs that were traced back to this tryptophan. It was another one of these things. As soon as they figured out that there was potential harm, the company threw away all the information, threw away all the data, said, no, it's not us. Independent research later confirmed that it was due to the genetic modification. What happened is the bacteria produced the tryptophan so quickly that the tryptophan started reacting against each other, and it created this toxic compound that was then sold in the supplements. So health effects, I just have to laugh at I pulled this off the internet somewhere, I don't know, but apparently GMOs cause everything. Constipation, diarrhea, you could be smarter, you could be dumber, I don't know. It's like everything. I always love it when it's one root cause. Our bodies are not that simple. However, what I can say is that, at least in the research, that there is evidence to suggest that there are potential health effects with ingestion of genetic modified organisms. So we're going to go through some of those. Did anyone see Breaking Bad? This may be, I'm kind of a movie person. No Breaking Bad fans in here? Okay, I'll skip this because you won't get it. It's a joke. Lectins are substances that are naturally occurring in the environment. They can be toxic in our bodies. They're found in food. They're found in potatoes. They're found in grains. They're found in beans. And so there's a lot of interest in research in lectins and how they play in our body and that sort of thing. Most lectins are inactivated when you cook food. And so in general, cooked lectins aren't a big cause for concern. Well, a company had developed a genetically modified lectin, and they had turned to Dr. Pousset to do research on it. The way they did the research is they fed rats potatoes that had genetically modified lectin, and then they fed them potatoes, just regular potatoes that have the naturally occurring lectins in them. And they saw what they did, and alarmingly, these rats had significantly worse outcomes. They developed basically what we call leaky guts. Their guts were it looked like someone had taken shears and clipped them off, and they had intestinal malabsorption, which leads to inflammation. And many people think that that's a very common link to a lot of our chronic inflammatory conditions. The problem is that before his research was completed, Dr. Pousset actually went on a radio show. He was very alarmed at what he had found, and he made some comments. He didn't really share the research in general, but he did make some inflammatory comments about using society as a guinea pig. And I have a picture of the reaction of the biotech industry. That pretty much sums it up. So Dr. Pousset, he was immediately, there was a swift reaction. I mean, scientists say things sometimes, maybe they should, but I mean, it was hardcore. They sealed his lab. They confiscated his data. And it was interesting, though. The guys in Europe came to his aid, and they all did independent research, and he was exonerated, basically. Eventually, his findings were published in The Lancet, which is a strong medical journal, and he was awarded a whistleblower award. But the fallout to his career was long-term. The second author of the paper actually had to leave science. He said that his opportunities were limited at a high level. That was his quote. Interestingly, the biotech company awarded the institute where Dr. Pousset worked, the biotech company awarded the institute a whole bunch of money right about the time he was suspended. So that was a little sketchy. Another researcher that kind of went down, Dr. Sorrell, I can't even say his name now. Anyone speak French? Sorrellini, I'm going to totally butcher it. He's a pretty outspoken person who does a lot of research about genetically modified foods. One of the concerns is that biotech limits their safety trials to 90 days, like we talked about before. And Dr. Sorrellini did a long-term study in rats with genetically modified Roundup Ready corn. That's the corn where you can spray the glyphosate and not kill the plant. So he actually followed these rats out for 2 years. And I got to tell you, again, kind of really interesting. When he went to the press conference with his findings, he had the press sign these non-disclosure agreements, and they had to pay money to get early access to it was kind of sketchy. When the paper was out, there was a lot of criticism that the methods that he used were unusual, but he really caused quite a stir, and this hit the press pretty strongly. Because of the controversy surrounding it, the paper was asked to retract his research, and they said no. These are the guidelines for retraction of a scientific article, and they said he has done none of these. It was peer-reviewed. Several people reviewed the studies. They said it was adequate for publication. The journal finally did retract the article, and this is how that happened. Professor Goodman, who's actually from Nebraska, got on the board. They developed a new position called the Associate Editor for Biotechnology. That had never been a position before. And once he joined the board, right after that, the paper was retracted. So there was a lot of drama around, was his presence, did he influence them? Monsanto was the company that was affected. Dr. Goodman had been employed by Monsanto for about 7 years. And so, again, a lot of drama. The paper was republished the next year in a different journal, and the findings were these, that these rats who had been fed the genetically modified corn for 2 years showed lots of kidney disease, liver disease, necrosis, inflammation, consistent with what we call fatty liver, which is increasingly the number one cause of liver failure in the United States. The rats died early, and then there were a lot of mammary tumors. That was the picture you saw before on the female rats. Secondly affected was the pituitary and a lot of endocrine dysfunction. And so really scary results suggesting that there may be problems with these products. Certainly the products are not the same. Conventional corn, genetically modified corn and non-genetically modified corn are not the same in terms of the nutritional composition. Non-GMO corn has more calcium, more magnesium, more manganese. And when you think that these products are in everything, those nutritional deficiencies can certainly add up. This was another study from the British Journal of Nutrition. This one was in salmon. They used the botulism toxin corn, and they fed the salmon. And what they showed is that the corn wasn't metabolized like normal corn. They weren't able to extract the nutrition from the corn as effectively as they were conventional corn. And they didn't get as much nutrition from it, and it altered their lipids. It basically changed their gut, and again, showed some leaky gut type issues. This is a more recent study from last year showing that, and I know this is a lot of medical words, but when we talk about glutathione metabolism, what we're talking about is the detoxification pathways of the body, how our body gets rid of the toxins that we're exposed to. And so what this study suggested is that this product increases inflammation and decreases your body's ability to get rid of toxins. Another study on genetically modified corn that shows destruction at the level of the endothelium or at the lining of the gut. This was a 90-day trial on rats. And you can see on the left, this is a normal gut, and on the right, the gut that's been exposed to the corn. This is Professor Krogdahl over in Norway. They did some feeding studies also on rats. This was a kind of an international research project trying to do independent research. And what they showed is that these rats that were fed the GMO corn, they were fatter, and same thing with the salmon. And so her question was, if this applies to humans, and the fact that corn is, we're king corn here, right? Corn is everywhere. What would happen over years and years and years of eating these substances? How is that going to affect our nutrition? How is that going to affect our body composition? And if it's in everything that we're doing. And even scarier is that they found that the genes that are in the corn may be able to be transferred into humans. And so if you think about that, you have this corn, and in the corn, the genetic material is secreting botulism toxin, and that material can actually cross into your bloodstream, and now you have genetic material that secretes botulism toxin. And there's just not any studies on this. We don't know what to do with this. You have to think about the fact that when GMOs were created, we didn't even know the gut microbiome existed. And now what we know is that the gut microbiome is an intricate part of our bodies. These organisms in your gut communicate directly with your hormone signaling pathways in your brain. They modulate the immune system and inflammation. I attended a recent lecture series, and the person boldly stated that your gut microbiome determines whether or not you get disease, whether or not you're fat or thin, and basically what you decide to do for the day. Little radio controls up to the brain. If this corn can transfer material to your gut microbiome and now you secrete toxin, what is that doing to us long term? And we don't know. So Monsanto's definitely in the news. You have to be living under a rock not to hear this stuff. So this is Whitewash. It's a book that has just been put out this last month by Carrie Gillum. Earlier this summer, the IARC, which is the International Agency on the Research on Cancer, classified glyphosate as cancer-causing. And that has stoked fury from every corner of the globe. There's a lot of finger pointing. People are angry. Companies are blaming the government's blaming companies. They're blaming research from 30 years ago. Even journalists are pointing fingers at each other, claiming that some journalists are biased for or against biotech, et cetera. Carrie's book basically goes into the history of the research on glyphosate and how it got approved and then what the studies have done, basically accusing the company of knowing that the agent caused cancer, hiding and manipulating the data, and paying off the federal government. So if you're interested in this topic, this might be a book to read, or maybe not. It's kind of scary. Since the IARC classified glyphosate as cancer-causing, there's been over 1,000 lawsuits filed. So I think we're going to find out the truth, but I think there's a lot of static noise right now. The environmental impacts of GMOs aren't direct. So if you think about, let me rephrase that. They're direct and indirect. So you have to, when you think about these compounds, you have to take into consideration that not only are we talking about corn that secretes botulism toxin, you're talking about bugs that are dead that birds might eat. But then you're also saying that if you make an herbicide-resistant field of corn, then by definition you're going to be spraying these pesticides. So you have to, the herbicides. So you have to look at not only the direct effects, but the indirect effects of what you're going to be spraying. And so that's important with like glyphosate, for example. The genetically modified food itself may be okay, but you also have to take into consideration the effects of the glyphosate. So that's what we're going to be talking about with environmental impact. These are butterfly larvae, and they go around and they eat plants and they get covered in pollen. And what the Cornell researchers showed, beyond a shadow of doubt, nobody argued this, is that they die. When they get the pollen on them from the corn that secretes botulism toxin, they die. And this is what the industry said. You know what? That's just tough. If you haven't figured it out, this company specifically, we don't talk about Cargill a lot. We don't talk about Syngenta a lot because Monsanto responds differently than other companies. They go after the scientists, and that's exactly what they did. They went after the Cornell scientists trying to discredit them. Then they funded their own studies, and usually industry-funded studies are in favor of industry. And they created a scientific meeting to give the results, but they had actually already released the outcome before the meeting. So it was a pretty rough time. It caused a pretty visceral reaction for most people. I think a lot of people can understand the effects of butterflies and why they're important to our natural resources and pollination. And so when you look at the non-GMO stamp that you see on food products, the butterfly is the symbol for non-GMO foods. And this is why. It was based on the Cornell research that showed destruction of the butterfly when they were exposed to these products. I don't know if you guys check the fields when you're driving around, but I see these plants all the time. Amaranthus palmeri has been called the weed of the year the last 2 years. It's kind of a sick joke. These weeds we call them super weeds for short. There's been over 380 identified so far with about 100 million acres that are affected. I actually read a report that some of these weeds can get greater than 10 feet, and they have really thick stalks. So what's happened is, we grew these soybean and corn fields that were resistant to glyphosate, but after a few years, the weeds got resistant too. And so you have these glyphosate-resistant weeds that you can't pull down even with combines. I thought it was interesting as I was preparing, I came across this statement at the bottom, dead weeds will not become resistant. That's what the company said when they marketed these products to farmers, and farmers asked questions. I mean, weed resistance is not a new problem. We've had weed resistance for a long time. And that was their plan, is if you kill the weeds, they won't become resistant. Well, they did. And now we have this problem of super weeds, which is a really big deal for farmers that are trying to grow their crops. And so I thought that this quote from John Paul II was appropriate about sooner or later the earth rebels. And I think about that when I think about these huge amaranthus weeds that are in the fields. I have some of these on my farm, and we don't have crops on our farm, but they're carried in the wind and by birds. The latest hit, besides the cancer thing for Monsanto, is what's called Dicamba drift. So because weeds have become increasingly resistant to glyphosate, farmers are turning now to the next poison, and that's Dicamba. This is actually a really old herbicide that's been around for a long time, but it hasn't been used because it's a very volatile substance. Meaning that it evaporates off the plant and gets carried to your neighbor. And when your neighbor's vegetation dies, they don't like you very much. And this has already happened. I was reading that there was a dispute between two farmers. I think it was in Arkansas. And one of the farmers shot and killed the other farmer over this issue. It's crazy. Anyway, so dicamba-resistant soybeans were approved in 2016, and they were planted this year. And people were very excited to get them because now they have all these glyphosate-resistant weeds in their fields. And so now they can plant these dicamba soybeans, and they can spray their field with the dicamba, and it'll kill these huge 10-foot weeds. The problem is that the company, Monsanto, said that they had a new version of dicamba that didn't drift as much. But they released the seeds before they released the new dicamba, and so people were ready to spray and didn't have the new product yet. So that was part of the problem. And then even with the release of the new products, it was a little bit more volatile than they thought. And so farmers that normally are very pro this company have risen up and said, "Hey, wait a minute! I did everything right, and my crops are dying." So this is a picture of the leaf curl that you see from dicamba drifts. It's going to hit the market really hard this year. In true biotech fashion, the company blamed the farmers and said that they weren't spraying correctly and that their equipment was contaminated and it's not our fault kind of thing. But weed scientists have now confirmed that no, it really is their fault and that more tests should have been done, and these probably shouldn't have been released on the market. So I also like this quote from Prince Charles, is we just don't know the consequences, neither to the human health or to the environment. And that we should really have a little bit more humility before bringing these things out into the world. The issue is that even if we shut down even if you agree that the evidence is clear that these have environmental and potential health consequences, even if we shut them down, it wouldn't matter because they're out there. As I showed you with the Starlings Corn, I mean, that was shut down in like 2001, and they found corn in 2013 in Saudi Arabia. And GMOs don't understand fence boundaries. These things are carried around, and they get they're part of our lives now. And so I think the best we can do at this point is learn from what we know now. We should be having conversations about these agents. They shouldn't be done in secret labs and kept under the FDA. We should have a lot more conversation about whether or not we should be patenting life and whether that should even be allowed. And I think that with the CRISPR technology, we're well past due to start having those conversations. I think that that's going to get people's attention faster than anything because it does have implications for humans. All right, well, I'm going to stop there because I only have about 5 minutes left, and I know that you guys wanted some time for questions. So I think the way we're going to do this, because we have an online audience, is if you'll just say the question and then I'll repeat it for the microphone, and then I'll do my best to answer. Yeah. Oh, thank you. I think you're a plant. So the question is this what's happening to our bees? So my answer is yes and no. There's certainly evidence to suggest that especially glyphosate affects pollinators. But the thing that's killing our bees is actually a different type of pesticide called a neonic. They're incredibly toxic to our bee population. And that, I'll boldly say that they are the cause of the colony collapse that we're seeing with our bees. Neonics were brought forward because they're less toxic to humans, but they're profoundly toxic to bees at very small doses. I just read there's a kind of a bee news magazine that my dad gave me, and I read a couple of series from that. It's depressing. I mean, we're in real trouble. Real trouble. Yes. Yeah, so biotech's response to that is they're creating drone bees.
Do a study on that.
I know, right? Yeah, pretty scary. We have bees, and we have bees in the front part of our farm, and they're doing great. But we have a drone yard in the back. My dad has this idea about creating these Varroa-resistant drone lines. If you can't tell, my dad is a really big beekeeper, and he makes his own queens. But anyways, so it's way far in the back, and my dad called me the other day and said all of my drones are dead. And if it was the middle of the winter, you'd think maybe they froze, maybe they ran out of food, whatever, but it wasn't. It wasn't, and they were full of food. And it was pesticide drift. And so what's happened is we have a farm, a crop farm next to us, and the farmer rented out his field, and they planted alfalfa. And the first year they did it, they didn't spray and they didn't do anything. They sprayed 3 times this year, and they didn't tell us they were spraying. And my bees are dead. So, yeah, we'll be having a conversation with our next door neighbor. Yeah, so the question is, how do you stop them? So immediately, it's a conversation with the least I can do is ask them to tell me when they're going to spray so that I can button in my bees. But these pesticides stick around in the soil forever. And so ultimately, what we would like to do is cooperate with our neighbor and do something else with that land instead of having GMO alfalfa planted on there. And that's a conversation and a relationship, but it's probably the right thing to do, not just for our bees, but for the land. And you think about the drinking water, and you think about if they're killing my bees, what are they doing to my kids? We have a pretty cool neighbor, so yeah, multiple hands.
How realistic do you think it is, like when stuff is labeled non-GMO, that with all of the cross-contamination, how realistic is it really not?
Yeah, so the question is about how realistic is it that something that's labeled GMO or organic is truly not GMO or organic. I should probably touch on the labeling rules just for a second. You guys probably know them because you're a little bit different audience. So if something is labeled organic, it is by definition not genetically modified, okay? There's also the non-GMO label, which does not mean that it's organic. So organic has to do with if it was raised with within organic standards. And organic standards have to do with herbicides and pesticides, not necessarily sustainability, but herbicide and pesticide. Non-GMO it may or may not have been grown with herbicides and pesticides, but it's not using genetically modified corn, soybean materials, et cetera. I think that there is some data that says that there's cross-contamination, even into some of the organics. What that label represents that it was grown within those standards. If it was contaminated, it may have been after the harvesting ends. And just like the Starlings corn, where it showed cross-contamination of the different types of corns, you have to know kind of what mill it's going to and how they're milling and if they're keeping their machinery separate. So if the machine to mill the GMO corn is used to do the non-GMO corn, then there's going to be some cross-contamination. So all of those things have to be taken into account.
So speaking of organic, how about the ones that like organic from Canada, organic from Mexico, from being in a quality background, how do we know that that's truly a quality organic product?
Yeah, so the question is, if it's labeled organic but it's from another country, what does that mean? And so if it's labeled USDA organic, that means it's met the United States definition of organic produce. And I don't know if you guys read about this stuff, but the organics are really under fire too. And that's kind of a whole nother talk. The biggest marketer of organic products is actually Walmart. And Big Organics has challenged a lot of the farms that are trying to do sustainable and local. So that's a different conversation, right? We can talk about pesticides and herbicides, but that doesn't necessarily talk about sustainability in the local food movement and nutritional composition of food. So it gets really complicated. You feel like you need a map on how to eat. We were talking earlier, it's either really complicated or it's really simple. Eat food like God intended, eat locally, grow everything yourself, really easy stuff like that. Yes, ma'am. Oh, great question. And I don't know the answer. The question is, does reverse osmosis remove pesticides and herbicides? And I need to look that up with our recent exposure. I have that question myself. We have a reverse osmosis system on our water, but I don't know if it removes those. Does anyone know the answer to that? Okay. If you give me your number, I'll get back to you because I have it on my list to look up. I hope so. I know. This is a depressing topic. The more you read, you're like, I can't even breathe. Hold my breath. Don't drink water. Don't breathe. It'll solve the problem really fast. Did you have a question over here? No? Okay, I thought you had your hand up. So, yes, ma'am.
I'm assuming that a lot of this stuff gets passed by lobbyists. And is there any way we could contribute to the other side? Is there anybody lobbying against this?
So sure.
Foundations or anything we can contribute to get on the wagon here?
Yeah, so the question is about lobbying on either side. So there's strong lobby, obviously, for the biotech companies, and they have more lawyers than we have people in the state of Kansas, I'm pretty sure. And there's a lot of money behind those movements. I'm kind of a pessimist. I don't see the answer in big government. I don't know that we're going to be able to get them to turn from that level. I think it's going to have to be grassroots. People are going to have to care, number one, and then they're going to have to start voting with their food dollars. The more people who vote at the grocery store against these GMO foods and do organic or non-GMO, the more that market grows. It's the only market in the grocery store that is actually growing. And that speaks, that's a big message to food growers. They want to provide products that we're going to buy. And so if we're interested in non-GMO and organics, that's what they're going to try to do. And that's what you're seeing the market turn. I thought Chipotle was a great canary in the coal mine when Chipotle announced that they were going, GMO free. That's a big deal, and a lot of other places followed suit. Campbells did the same thing and announced that they would be going GMO free. And a lot of these big food companies have created their own organic companies too. There are lobbies for these movements. There's lobbies that support some of the research that I shared with you today that you can contribute to. Friends of the Earth is one of them. Friends of the Earth. So yeah, if you're interested in contributing in that way, there certainly are organizations out there that are actively trying to get the message out, trying to educate, and trying to produce, science, peer-reviewed science. When these products are reviewed initially, no one else can look at them. Only the biotech company can test them. And we have to trust them that the data that they produce is factual. And so there's other ways to fight back against that, and that's what some of these professors have done. Great questions. Anyone else? All right, well, thank you for your attention on this complicated matter. Appreciate it.